Welcome to Wrestling at Random. I'm Jeremy Deemer.
And I am Adam Summers. You are in season 5 of Wrestling at Random, where the theme, if you've been listening, you know, if this is your first time, you're about to find out, is more wrestling than ever for season 5. That is the theme. Some 19, 20,000, somewhere around there. Wrestling shows, TV episodes, pay-per-views, special events, all those sorts of things. Upwards of 60,000 hours of wrestling thrown into the randomizer. We run it. It picks something for us to watch. We've run the gamut from very mainstream, borderline modern wrestling to very obscure things. Many decades have been spanned. Here it is in the free feed, I believe, another first-time territory for us, and one of, if not the oldest shows we've ever reviewed in the bonus feed, as it isn't
in the free feed, yeah, because we've done older shows in the bonus feed.
We had one for the 50s, I believe, in the bonus feed, but here in the free feed, this may be the oldest show. It is Championship Wrestling, that being Fred Kohler's Championship Wrestling from Chicago. By the way, this is the forerunner to the Bob Loose Championship Wrestling that my dad would watch in the mid to late 60s into the early 70s as a kid. That was the reason I then became a wrestling fan, because it made him a wrestling fan. Here, this is from September of 1961, as best as we can sleuth out, because it does not have an actual date, from the Marigold Arena in Chicago, Illinois.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Let's figure out what's going on in wrestling at this time here. So, wrestling in Chicago was a staple on WGN TV. When WGN TV went on the air in 1948, it broadcast wrestling 3 nights a week, live in prime time from 3 different arenas in Chicago. The Saturday night show from the Marigold Arena aired in about half of the country on the old Dumont network.
Wow.
At its peak, it was rumored, supposedly, to have drawn a 50 share, meaning half the televisions in the United States were watching the Dumont Network and professional wrestling from the Marigold Arena.
So when they refer to it on this show, and the announcer, whose name we attempt to discern, but when he says that this is the pro wrestling capital of the world, or the pro wrestling capital of the United States, according to those numbers, it's not that far off.
That's right. The Marigold Arena was located at 817 West Grace, which is right by the corner of Grace, Halsted, and Broadway, if you know the north side of Chicago. Currently, it's the Faith Tabernacle Church right next to the IHOP on Grace there. Not
that far from where I am broadcasting from right now. Probably a 10-minute drive at best.
Yeah, my cousin lives right on that same street, and the right across from what was the Marigold Arena, they had a bowling alley called the Marigold Bowl, which I also have bowled at before it was demolished and replaced with a condo building. It's in the Wrigleyville, Lakeview neighborhood, if you will. In 1949, Leonard Schwartz bought the 2,800-seat Rainbow Arena in Chicago to run opposition to Fred Kohler. The Rainbow Arena was located up in Andersonville, right by Foster and Clark, over in that area. Schwartz was turned down for membership by the NWA at first, but by establishing partnerships with Toots Munt and Jim Londis, and Al Haft, a promoter in Columbus who controlled Buddy Rogers and much of the top talent in the country at the time, who was also an original NWA member. It was this war that led to a famous Gorgeous George Don Eagle match in 1950 in Chicago, when Eagle won the AWA championship, a title that was controlled by Haft, and he lost the title on a Kohler show in a double-cross finish when he refused to do the job. But due to a fast count, and very similar to the Bret Hart Shawn Michaels, where the referee got in a car and immediately sprinted out of the building and left. Very
the
similar
Chicago screw job. Is that what this was?
That's what it was. Kohler then booked George to lose to Lou Thez, July 27th, 1950, to make the NWA belt look like the real deal. Schwartz then got a contract with ABC television. So with that kind of power, the NWA admitted Schwartz as a member.
Funny how that works.
Which meant he had the right to get dates on world champion Lou Thez. However, you had a real world champion claim here, and you had Fred Kohler very upset that he was allowed in and allowed to get dates on Lou Thez. And so when we look at what happened during this period, Kohler complained to Sam Mushnick that they had built up Thez nationwide on their TV and promoted the match where he beat George to screw the opposition. And now he's working for the opposition. This is not
Sam
good.
Mushnick, we should mention, was the president of the NWA at this time, the promoter in St. Louis that had a ton of power.
We'll hear him be mentioned on this broadcast as we review the show.
Along with every other territory promoter basically in the country.
In response, Kohler and Jim Barnett, who was his assistant at the time, and due to pressure from the Dumont Network, which wanted a champion on its network that it could control, they stopped using Lou Thez. They created their own championship, the U.S. title. And like with the NWA, they put it on Vern Gagne against the wishes of the NWA. In another move that made the NWA unhappy, they signed Gagne to the same contract that Lou Thez had, where he would make 10% of the after-tax gross. And by this point, Kohler also gained control of much of the Northeast, as Toots Munt was deeply in debt due to a gambling problem. And to get cash, he sold Fred Kohler 60% of his operations. With the network television and control of both New York and Chicago, the belief was that Barnett and Kohler were planning on going national some 30 years before Vince McMahon did so.
Wow. Can you imagine what the professional wrestling world and landscape would look like now if someone had successfully gone national 30 years before the WWF and Vince McMahon and WrestleMania 1 and the Rock and Wrestling Connection? There's no way of knowing how different things would be.
Eventually, this story was ended by television. Wrestling had gotten so overexposed, and there was so much on free TV that ratings slid. ABC dropped wrestling. With no TV, Schwartz faded away quickly. Kohler and Barnett negotiated for Thez to come back to Chicago because the entire reason they were fighting was eliminated by the NWA there. The Dumont Network went out of business, and no other network was interested in professional wrestling on network television until NBC put it on in 1985 with Saturday night's Main Event.
It's crazy how, there's multiple things in that history that you just told everybody that just have that. The more things change, the more they say the same vibe to it. The screw job all the way back then that you referenced, the idea that, TV is so important and such a driving force behind boom periods in wrestling, and the loss of TV is the driving force behind the death of promotions that were previously successful. I mean, how much does that sound like Jamie Kellner and Time Warner, AOL, and WCW all the way in 2001?
Yeah, it's interesting how long ago this was and how similar it is to even modern times where everyone's looking at what the next television deal means to their promotion.
Yeah, and how you can, if you have a great TV deal, you are tremendously successful, and then the second you lose that TV deal, you're basically dead in the water.
So let's get into this episode of television. This is a full episode of television, so something that would have aired in prime time on the Dumont Network, WGN TV here. It's called, we just get a graphic at the beginning that says Wrestling Champions. And we're told, again, it's the center of the wrestling world. And he runs down our announcer who, what did we decide on the name?
Well, when I first heard it, I thought he said it was Matt Alberts, but as the show went along, I'm pretty sure it's Melt Alberts, which apparently was a name back in 1961. He welcomes us to another evening of top wrestling, tells us that we'll be back shortly with the greatest show on earth. We should also note that in the intro, the graphics say Wrestling Champions produced by the Sports Publicity Institute.
I do want to reference that was Dave Meltzer, Wrestling Observer Newsletter's recap on that Chicago history. Here we're running down the card, and then we have a segment called Wrestlers Sound Off, where wrestlers come and pull up a chair next to our announcer, and we've got Billy Gills and Johnny Gilbert sitting down to talk.
Yes, and they're ringside. Like the announcer, Melt Alberts, is right up against the apron sitting there, and then wrestlers throughout the show will pull up a chair, as you said, sit next to him. They say they have a good Gil says we have a good schedule laid out for us. The promoters have been trying to keep us together, and that's fine by me. I want to team with this man for the rest of my career. They said they need to beat Case and Volkoff, as well as Mark Lewin and Don Curtis, who have apparently just changed their tactics. We're going to get Maniac Mark Lewin here as a young pretty boy tough guy. What a change. Think about that, the Florida show that we did that had Mark Lewin as just this dead face satanic dude with Kevin Sullivan.
Yes.
in the 80s, like in the early 80s to mid 80s. Here in 1961, he is wrestling.
So this was more of a chat than a promo. Wasn't really like what you think of a wrestling promo.
It's like a ABC Wide World of Sports chat type of deal. There aren't really wrestling promos on the show. Even the one manager that we'll see, it's less of a wrestling promo than just a discussion.
We go to Leonard Sterling, our ring announcer for the first bout. He tells us Australian tag team match. I still don't know what that means. We heard that before.
Well, I think that's where these rules, the tag team rules of tagging in and out, that sort of thing was developed in Australia. So it's an Australian rules tag team match, which just means a tag match.
We've got the team of the good-looking lads, Mark Lewin and Don Curtis, with their manager, Mighty Atlas, taking on the team of Santiago Acosta and Jose Bentancourt in a 2 out of 3 fall tag match.
Yes, we are told that Lewin and Curtis are from Buffalo, while Acosta and Bentancourt are from Puerto Rico. What would you guess the age is of one Mark Lewin here?
So I know, when we talked about Mark Lewin in that Florida episode that you mentioned, because we were surprised he was still wrestling in the 80s because we knew he was older. So, and I know he was wrestling in like the 50s. So, man, he's got to be like 25 here probably.
24.
Oh, yeah, that's
Hold
crazy.
this show up on YouTube if you're listening. Watch this show and just imagine this is what 24-year-old men looked like.
Teen idols.
1961. Yes, these guys are described as teen idols. Neither of them look a day under 42 years old. And even that is being very generous to these looks. We should also mention that to me, like the hallmark of this show being a 1961 wrestling TV show is like how long the things that take like 5 seconds on modern wrestling shows take here. We have the introductions and we have to introduce the attending physician,
yes,
the timekeeper, the referee. The introductions happen, and then it feels like 5 minutes pass between when those introductions end. The referee is telling the wrestlers the rules, the seconds are getting out of the ring, and then finally the match starts.
It's a boxing presentation. So
yes,
it's 100%. What you get, modern MMA is a sped up version of old boxing. This is a 1-to-1 old boxing presentation, to where we had the referee giving instructions for a long time here to start this match. Curtis starts, and he's stalling early. This is the first time I've seen Don Curtis. I was pretty excited to see him because I've also heard of Don Curtis as well. So I was looking forward to seeing him. Curtis is stalling.
Don Curtis, or as he's referred to by ring announcer Leonard Sterling, Don Curtis. These early 60s Chicago pronunciations of things are hilarious.
Acosta takes a swing at Lewin on the apron, and Curtis takes the opportunity to jump him from behind. Lewin and Curtis double teaming Acosta in their corner. Acosta gets knocked outside, but his partner comes over to help him back into the ring. Acosta jumps from the apron over the top, kicking Lewin at the same time, all in one motion.
Like a slingshot 1 foot Rob Van Dam drop kick. I was not expecting that. A lot of the highlights early on in this match were just the commentary and just the differences in visuals. Like the referee looks like he's straight out of a 50s gas station.
Yeah,
like
and this is like a commission assigned referee. Like,
yes. Well, then the funny thing is, I remember going to my first wrestling show at the UIC Pavilion, WCW, on May 3rd, 1992, and there's like an old man referee that was like 90 years old. That was, you'd always have to have one state athletic commission referee on wrestling shows, and even into the 90s in Chicago. I honestly wonder if it's one of the referees on this show. Also, fashion corner. There is no fashion in 1961.
No fashion.
All four men are basically dressed as young lions. They're just wearing black tights, no knee pads, no elbow pads. I don't know if wrist tape even existed back then. We have Melt Alberts telling us that the next time you visit Chicago, plan your visit around a trip to the Marigold Arena. He said the capital of wrestling. Matt also takes us on a quick trip to Haircut Corner as he describes the differences between Lewin's crew cut and Curtis's crew cut, and Lewin's slightly more grown out hair. This is also where we are told that the heels, that being the team of Lewin and Curtis, have a friend and advisor in their corner, the mighty Atlas, who is many things, but he does not look like a mighty Atlas. He looks like he's straight out of the movie Goodfellas.
Lewin grabs Acosta by the head, and Curtis ends up coming off the top with a kick to the back. Crazy double team move for 61.
Several times throughout the first two falls in this match, we'll have a moment where like one of the baby faces is starting to rally, and then out of frame,
yeah,
Lewin or Curtis comes hurtling through the 1961 air with a knee to the back off the top rope. I was not expecting that.
Bentancourt's in. He trades punches with Lewin. Lewin again grabs a guillotine, and Curtis comes flying in with a knee to the back of Bentancourt. Lewin then has him on the mat, stretches him out, and Bentancourt submits to end the first fall.
Yeah, 3 minutes and 48 seconds, we're told. Every move, it's really funny. The ring announcer will tell us the move that ends the match. No matter what the move is, it's a backbreaker. It's
a backbreaker or a body press if it's just a pin.
Exactly. Those are the two moves, except for one surprising thing. I was surprised in 1961 that they had this as the name and got it right. But this was basically like a stretch muffler here in the early 60s, getting the submission win.
Wrestlers sound off again between falls. We get the tag team of Johnny Case, who's the Midwest heavyweight champion, and Nikolai Volkoff. Not that Nikolai Volkoff.
I was just going to say, I can't, it's hard for me to believe that this Nikolai Volkoff, who did not look particularly young, could be the same Nikolai Volkoff 23 years later that kind of looked roughly the same age, even though looked differently in the mid-'80s in the WWF.
No. Case is explaining that the competition's no good here. Volkoff then speaks, and he has more of a Chicago accent than a Russian accent. He's not even trying to be Russian.
No, he says, direct quote, "We want to get booked with those two G's," talking about Gilbert and Gills.
Yeah, they won't answer their challenge. We go to the second fall. So we've seen Lewin before, like we mentioned, but who knew that Don Curtis was this cool? Don Curtis, he's He's holding him this time so Lewin can come off the top of the knee to the back. We get a full Nelson from Don Curtis as Lewin comes and throws some cheap shots in. Chops to the chest by Curtis while Lewis is holding Acosta.
You talked about that full Nelson from Curtis. How about the full Nelson and using from that position to buckle his opponent,
Yes.
ramming his head into the top rope or into the top turnbuckle in the corner over and over for the full Nelson. Somebody, a power wrestler, needs to bring that back now.
Bentancourt tags in. Lewin in a chin lock. He turns his opponent so that his opponent's back is facing Curtis's corner. So Curtis takes advantage by coming off the top with the knee to the back again.
Yes, that is the preferred move here from the heel tag team. I also love how like the early part of this fall is Lewin being super, super tentative, trying to lure Acosta into the corner. And Bentancourt will run into the ring and be like, no, don't fall into the trap. Don't do it. So then when Bentancourt tags in, he stands in center and like with his
draws
fingers,
a line,
draws an imaginary line down the center of the ring, telling Lewin and Curtis, I'm not following you in the corner. You got to come out and fight me.
We get a double team. We get a overhead press into a double gut buster.
Okay. Let's stop and make sure that sinks in. It is 1961 and Don Curtis and his tag team partner, Mark Lewin, press their opponent, double press slam style over their heads, and then drop him forcefully across their knees in a stomach breaker in 1961.
Lewin puts on the same stretch that he won the first fall with, and he gets the submission again. Lewin and Curtis win in 2 straight falls. They throw their opponents over the top outside after the match.
Well, the first one, they throw Jose just out on one side, just through the ropes. Then they pick Acosta up. Like they're going to do like a turning double body slam. And they just like go back and go forward and go back and like heave-ho him over the top rope like a javelin. This was terrifying as Bentancourt lands like back first on this single stair wooden plank pushed up against the ropes. This is like a more terrifying version of the over on the bonus feed, that Memphis show that we reviewed recently, where the Mod Squad, was it?
Where they threw that guy over the top to the studio floor. Oh,
yes, this was basically exactly like that.
So we see Curtis perched on the top rope. He's teasing coming off the top to the floor, but then jumps back in the ring instead.
These guys are freak athletes and terrifying. So that happens, and you're like, oh my God. Then it's almost scary when he then just decides to stand straight up on the top rope in the corner, looking menacingly out to the floor. We then go from there to Melta Albert's ringside with all 3 men, with Lewin, Curtis, and the Mighty Atlas. The Mighty Atlas is talking, but I'm so distracted because Mark Lewin is terrifying, pacing back and forth in front of Atlas, jawing with the fans. You can very easily see the early stages of Mark Lewin being this like psychotic, like psychological thriller villain that he would be into the 80s, as we talked about in Florida.
Yeah, and something to note here, I love Don Curtis. Did not know that I was a fan. Now I am. And my, adding another chapter of Mark Lewin to my experience. This is a thumbs up all around. And if you're watching this, this full episode's on YouTube as of the time of this recording. You'll see they cut to the crowd at one point here, and there's lots of sailors in the crowd.
Yes.
And I immediately was like, they must be from the Great Lakes Naval Base in the northern suburbs coming down for the wrestling show. That makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have Mighty Atlas here, I said, cutting a promo of sorts. And for a 1961 heel wrestling manager promo, like I was intrigued by him. He had an interesting delivery. He's trying to be this like really like upscale dude. He's telling in a very nice way telling Melt to refer to him as Your Excellency. He says it's merely an honorary term, and you don't have to say it after one time, but you must start every interview by referring to me as that. There's also, I thought, a low-key hilarious moment here where Melt is asking Atlas if Lewin and Curtis can speak for themselves, and Atlas says, absolutely, they can speak for themselves. Melt says, I would like a good evening. And Lewin says, good evening. And he says to Curtis, I'd like a hello. And Curtis says, hello. That's all they said.
We get a voiceover telling us that, before we close out on this, he also plugged that they will be at the International Amphitheater, and they want a World Tag Team Championship shot. So the big shows here at the Marigold would build towards the big events that happened at the International Amphitheater on Chicago's South Side.
And I believe it was in the bonus feed, we reviewed in the Abdullah the Butcher
Giant Baba.
Yeah, the Abdullah the Butcher curated list, an Abdullah Giant Baba match taped for Japanese television that aired from the International Amphitheater.
We get a voiceover from Fred Kohler telling us to put on a fundraiser by contacting June Strongbow at the Olympic Auditorium for the West Coast. For the East Coast, it's Vince McMahon in Washington, D.C. It's Sam Mushnick in St. Louis. In Toronto, it's Frank Tunney. In Minneapolis, it's Wally Carbo. And for Wisconsin, Indiana, and Illinois, it's Fred Kohler at the Marigold Arena. And this was it's a real who's who of the time. Like, all these names from wrestling history, and it's funny that they were just the promoters of the time at this point.
Yeah, it's really cool to hear them sort of all just in this little time capsule of a voiceover talking about how you can book a charity event for your organization and to call the wrestling booking office in each of these cities.
Our next match, Sweet Daddy Siki taking on Fred Atkins.
I was excited about this in that Sweet Daddy Siki is one of those names I've heard a million times. I don't know that I've ever actually seen him wrestle a match before.
Yeah, I don't think so either. People love Sweet Daddy Siki. They were going nuts cheering him on. Fred Kohler joins the broadcast to push booking your fundraiser, coming out to the shows in your area. We're told that Sweet Daddy Siki recorded a record called Rock and Roll Shimmy Shimmy Partner, and I have added this to my list of must-collect vinyl records. So I'm looking for this 45, Sweet Daddy Siki's Rock and Roll Shimmy Shimmy Partner.
Yes, that's it's the first thing I thought of. That this is going to be right up there with Be a Man, Randy Savage, and a few of the other things. So the full description of this by Melt Alberts is as follows. He says that Sweet Daddy Siki, in addition to continuing to be a full-time wrestler, has branched out into singing and is in fact a legit recording artist, having recorded a 45 RPM with Pearl Reeves and the Alpharetto Trio. The main song is, as you said, Rock and Roll Shimmy Shimmy Partner, and the B-side, the flip side, is Mama Gimme Your Permission.
This was all Atkins early. Siki fights back, knocks Atkins outside. Atkins' hand gets caught in the ropes at one point.
This is one of those classic old school things. It's a version of the Iron Mike Sharp, get your arms tied up in the ropes, but it's just his wrist. We always marvel at, how do the guys do this sort of sleight of hand to end up in the ropes without you seeing what they do to end up? He goes over the top, and then the next thing you know, his wrist is caught crisscrossed in the ropes.
Siki fights back with punches. Atkins catches him with a knee, but Siki's had enough, and he hits 2 drop kicks, jumping headbutt for the win.
Fred Atkins, billed from Sydney, Australia. He's just a guy. It's hilarious that Melt says that Fred knows judo and sumo wrestling and Greco-Roman. I don't necessarily believe that. He also points out and sort of chuckles to himself that the referee is Rocky Dempsey, and how that combines the names of 2 of the great boxing legends of the day. Sweet Daddy Siki has a ton of charisma.
He does.
I'm disappointed that as Melt Alberts takes us on a quick trip to Fashion Corner and tells us that Siki has candy stripe pattern tights, this black and white 60s broadcast does not pick up the candy stripes. I want to see some excitement here from the gear.
Curtis, Lewin, and Mighty Atlas are back for another interview. We're told that the Kangaroos are the tag team champions, and they say that they want the tag team champs.
Atlas has a great line where he says about his men, "We don't have a lot of trumpets blaring or hullabaloo."
Back to the ring. We're told curfew time limit is in effect as Sailor Art Thomas, announced as Seaman Art Thomas, taking on Ray Zells.
Ray Zells of Rockford, Illinois.
Rock Vegas, baby. Yeah.
Town I've spent way too much time in years gone past when I used to go to many Rockford Ice Hogs games as the affiliate of the Chicago Blackhawks. I was taken aback when we were told this is Seaman Art Thomas. Like, is there a rank? Did he sail enough between 1961 and like the late 60s, early 70s to become an official certified sailor? The one thing that is not different here is that Art Thomas is a physical specimen. He is jacked to the gills, and it is so crazy because like there's a 60s wrestler look. You're either like
barrel chested.
You're overweight. You're like old man, muscular, but not really barrel chested, or you've got that like swimmer's body where you're in good shape, but you're not like really muscular. And then you have Art Thomas, who looks like he's beamed in from like 1986 WWF.
I know Art Thomas is huge, and because we saw it just recently in one of the shows we reviewed. We saw Art Thomas. He took off his bathrobe and was like completely jacked, and we're like, holy crap! And so I was like, oh, I wonder how cut and ripped Art Thomas is here, and gigantic, completely insane for the time. This is huge. This is a physique that completely stood out, and the announcer couldn't stop talking about it.
He talks about how he's billed as the best physique in wrestling, and Melt says, I won't argue with that. He also then goes on a diatribe about how Ray Zells is 205 pounds and looks tiny in comparison, and muses how he knows that it's silly to call a 205-pound man, quote, little fella, but that's all he can think of to compare him to Art Thomas.
Thomas does one move, slaps on a bear hug for the win. 2 minutes and 28 seconds squash here for Art Thomas.
A bear hug that our ring announcer calls a backbreaker. By far, the most important information that is disseminated to us in this match, and maybe on this entire show, is our announcer Melt telling us that Ray Zells is an automobile race car driver, as he describes it. Is Ray Zells the father or maybe the grandfather of one Thurman Sparky Plug, who appeared on this podcast just a few weeks back, if you're listening in linear fashion?
Wrestlers sound off again. Acosta and Bentancourt are here for an interview.
They look exhausted and beaten after what occurred to them earlier.
They basically just say, well, the toughest team, that's Lewin and Curtis, who kicked our butts earlier in the show and are going for the tag team championship. Toughest team we've ever fought.
And the best part is we get it in two languages because one of the two men cannot speak English and has to have his tag partner translate. So we just hear multiple times, yeah, these guys are tough. They killed us. And these men look like they were destroyed.
Our final match of the evening. 2 out of 3 falls, curfew time limit. Johnny Gilbert taking on this Nikolai Volkoff.
This Nikolai Volkoff, who may in fact be a more compelling professional wrestler in 1961 than the actual Nikolai Volkoff.
It's not even close. The 85 Nikolai Volkoff that we just saw, we reviewed WrestleMania 1 over in the bonus feed. Nikolai Volkoff sucks. He's always, the 80s Volkoff always sucked. And
it sucks. To me, I just want to key in on what you had said about him in that WrestleMania 1 podcast that we did in the bonus feed, where it's not even that he's horrible.
No.
He's the most unremarkable wrestler maybe ever in a major promotion. Like once you get into the mid 80s and beyond, like when you get past him singing the Russian anthem, the Soviet anthem, and the fans booing him, like I can't recall a single thing that he did. He doesn't move in a unique way. He doesn't even do like fun, wacky 80s moves. Like I cannot tell you a single move that he does. Usually wrestlers from that era, in my mind's eye, the second I hear their name, I can like conjure up what their punch looked like, how they hit the ropes. Complete blank slate. I cannot conjure up anything in my mind about Nikolai Volkoff as an actual in-ring wrestler.
Unremarkable, total zero. And now here, this Nikolai Volkoff, way better. He's taking on Johnny Gilbert. Johnny Case is the second for Volkoff. He's in his corner. Gills is the second for Gilbert, the G&G connection over here.
That we heard from earlier in the first wrestler sound off.
Gilbert starts out hot until Volkoff cuts him off. They have a little bit of a back and forth, and then the pace slows down.
The pace slows down, but we had like hard lockups to begin. We had Gilbert throwing him off, whipping him around the ring with hip tosses. So like there's, again, by the standards of 1961, we're already seeing a hotter start than we saw in some of the matches earlier.
Yeah, and a lot of these matches are paced with a quick start, slow down, pick back up, or it's just slow build, peak at the end, and be done. Here, this was a start fast, and then we slow down with some Gilbert headlock takeovers. Volkoff, though, with belly-to-back suplexes his way free.
This back suplex, and we should know from a production standpoint, for 1961, yes, it's obviously black and white, but it's very good. There's a hard cam, and there's 2 or 3 other cameras that aren't ringside. Like, we don't have a ringside shoulder camera, but multiple shots where they get in close to the action. We have one of those shots on this back suplex. They both crack their heads hard, and for my money, Gilbert is not right the rest of this match. He's sucking wind. He's off balance. In the post-match promo after this, he talks about how that rocked him. I would be shocked if he did not have an undiagnosed 1961 concussion here off of that back suplex.
Gilbert puts on an abdominal stretch to win the first fall. Adam, have you ever heard the abdominal stretch called the Cobra Twist?
Yes, 100%. That's what it's called in Japan.
Yep.
To the point where I think most people assume that it's called the Cobra Twist from the wrestler the Cobra in 80s junior heavyweight wrestling in New Japan. It was one of those moments here, like when you hear the Tombstone Piledriver called the Tombstone Piledriver before the Undertaker existed as a character, or the Scorpion Deathlock on Ricky Choshu does it being called the Scorpion Deathlock pre-Sting. Hearing this called the Cobra Twist by this ring announcer, it shook me a bit.
I thought of you immediately. So I couldn't wait to tee you up for that one. Fall number 2.
We should just quick mention, you talked about the boxing style of the presentation. Here in between the falls, it's total boxing style with the seconds. They're in the corner. There aren't stools, but there might as well be during this long break in between falls that basically are rounds for all intents and purposes.
Fall number 2. This is all Volkoff. He's doing stomach claws. And then
over and over and over. He has to, because the stomach claw is apparently illegal in Chicago. It's the pile driver of Chicago, apparently. And so he has to lock it on and then break at 4 every single time. So he does it, he breaks, he does it, he breaks. Then Gilbert will fight out and then get pulled back down to the mat. This sequence repeats 3, 4, even maybe 5 times.
And Volkoff just gets the pin here. It was weird.
It was very weird because he gets the pin off of, like, while he has this illegal hold on. I was also amused by it was like heels being heels just because they're heels, even though it does not do anything functionally. It's one of your favorite things I know in like old time wrestling or wrestling in general. Here, the previous pin attempt from Volkoff, he pulls the tights, but he's like pulling the front of the tights instead of the back in a way that would not give you any leverage. It's like when you see a wrestling submission hold that, like, the guy's selling like crazy, but it's bending his arm or leg with the grain instead of against the grain. This was the trunk pull version of that.
So they want to see what's in Johnny Case's case.
So yeah, like between the first and second fall, like it was very strange. Volkoff is in the corner. Again, it's decent black and white footage for the time, but it's black and white footage. And so like Case is holding Volkoff close to him, and like Volkoff is sniffing a lot. I'm like, what the hell is going on here? Then that happens again during the second fall, or in between the second and the third fall, but you can see that Case actually has a case of some sort.
Case has a case in a case. This is
yes, and Melt is highly amused by this. Melt, what is the line he has here? He has a couple little joking lines about where is this? I took a note on. I was amused. Oh well.
It turned out to be nothing. Point. It turned out to be almost just a joke so that Melt could say Case has a case in a case.
Untrue. When this match ends,
we find out. So at this point, that's what I'm thinking. At this point, I'm watching. I'm like, turns out to be nothing. But no,
it looked like a tissue to me. Like there was something, but I look, okay, it's a tissue. He's sick. He has a cold, and he's allowing him to blow his nose into this tissue, and it's getting shoved into the case. Okay.
Fall number 3. Big Shot knocks Gilbert onto the announce table at ringside, and then we hit the curfew time. So this match, 1 fall apiece, ends in a draw. And apparently, what was in the case was Volkoff was using oxygen to recover during the falls.
Which was perfectly executed, because the first fall, like the guys were just going at it. And then after the first fall, from that point forward, Gilbert is completely gassed the rest of the match. Whereas Volkoff is fresh. Like that second fall begins after he gets what we now know as his hit of oxygen. And the bell rings and he charges all the way across the ring and attacks attacks Gilbert full speed.
They run down what happened on the show, and the show goes off the air. Favorite thing on this show for you, Adam?
Oh man, I would say it's seeing Mark Lewin in 1961, because we saw him as just this weird satanic old guy in the 80s in Florida with Kevin Sullivan, and later with Kevin Sullivan and Women. So that was entertaining. I highly enjoyed the reveal of it being an oxygen tank or an oxygen mask, and how that actually, like, once you find that out, how that immediately applies to what we saw in the match. I thought for 1961, that was really well done. For me, the worst thing on the show.
Oh, I want to give an honorable mention for best thing on the show to my newfound appreciation for the tag team of Mark Lewin and Don Curtis. Don Curtis, a wrestler, total blind spot for me, and he's great. And teaming with Mark Lewin, this is a great pretty boy heel tag team.
Yeah, pretty boy heel tag team in 1961 that looks like if you debuted this team in 2024, they would be the old grizzled mean guy tag team. But that's what a teen heartthrob looked like in 1961. I knew Curtis would be one of your honorable mentions. For me, the worst thing was just how long the stomach claw sequence went on in that second fall, and then the fact that he won with a stomach claw pin when it was an illegal hold. That was confusing to me.
Yeah, the other worst thing for me was not enough Art Thomas. This match only went 2 minutes. I want more Sailor Art Thomas in my life here. This is
Sailor Art Thomas is high on my list of people we've seen on this podcast where they're not particularly good wrestlers. I know he's not a particularly good wrestler, yet I am enthralled and fascinated by him being out there, just because he does not fit physically with anything else that you're seeing on the show. And so it's just, it's always really interesting to see him in these contexts.
And with that, we are going to call it a podcast. We mentioned a lot about our bonus feed. So we do have a Patreon, patreon.com/wrestlingatrandom. There we do an extra bonus episode every single week of the podcast. Over 160 plus at the time of this recording here, and growing. Your $5 unlocks the entire back catalog, an additional 160 plus episodes, in addition to this free feed that you have not heard. And they are wacky. They're from all over the place. Listener-chosen content, as well as weird things the randomizer has pulled. You can follow us on all of the social media platforms to find out what shows we're reviewing on this week's free feed as well as the bonus feed. We're on all social media platforms at Wrestle at Random. And usually we post a fun GIF to preview what the show will be. And so at Wrestle at Random, that's Instagram, X, Twitter, Threads, Blue Sky. We're everywhere. Make sure you're following us there. And WrestlingAtRandom.com, of course, has the entire back catalog of this podcast. Please continue to tell your wrestling fan friends about the show. Word of mouth is how we continue. Wrestling fans know other wrestling fans, so continue to spread the word. And if you listen to just the audio version of this podcast, I'm going to ask you to go over to our YouTube channel. If you go to YouTube, search Wrestling at Random Podcast. There, we have the video version of this podcast. You don't have to consume the video version if you don't want to. Some people do. That's the place to get it. If you want to continue to get the audio podcast, get it from your podcatcher of choice. But go over there, throw us that like, subscribe. That helps us work the algorithm so other wrestling fans can find the show. And with that, we are now calling it a podcast. Adam, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Randomizer. And thank you, Fred Kohler, because in a way, as I mentioned earlier, Fred Kohler and his territory and what it became is responsible for me becoming a wrestling fan.
Thanks again, everyone, for listening, and we'll talk to you again next time.